Hello, welcome to Classical Poets Live. I'm your host, Andrew Benson Brown. Sorry for the hiatus. I said this would be a fortnightly podcast, and it turns out I lied, because I've been absent for almost 2 months now. I've been trying to finish up the second volume of my mock epic poem, so I've been focusing exclusively on that. And now I'm back. I'm going to take a different track with this episode. I'm not interviewing anyone this time around. I'm going to spend some time instead addressing some critics of the Society of Classical Poets. One in particular, and properly situating it within the larger context of poetry publications today. So, since this is kind of a long episode, I'll just jump right into it. The liberal critics of the SCP and the reigning establishment that supports them would have you believe that the Society of Classical Poets is a fringe, alt-right group that occupies the margins of the poetry world. But is that really true? We're going to examine that claim today. I'm going to start off by responding to another YouTuber named Zoe Bee. 3 months ago or so, she uploaded a video to her channel called Anti-Woke Poetry is Terrible and Here's Why. Now, in this video, she specifically takes on the Society of Classical Poets. Now, she starts off by mentioning the site's biggest claim to fame, which is that it published the unofficial inaugural poem of Donald Trump back in January 2017, written by Joseph Charles MacKenzie. I'm just going to play the audio recording of the first 2 stanzas of this poem so you can get a sense of it if you're unfamiliar with it.
Inaugural poem for Donald J. Trump, Pibroch of the Domhnall, by Joseph Charles MacKenzie. All rights reserved. Come out for the Domhnall, ye brave men and proud, the scion of Torquil and best of MacLeod. With purpose and strength he came down from his tower, to snatch from a tyrant his ill-gotten power. Now the cry has gone up with a cheer from the crowd. Come out for the Domhnall, the best of MacLeod. When freedom is threatened by slavery's chains, and voices are silenced as misery reigns, we'll come out for a leader whose courage is true, whose virtues are solid and long overdue. For he'll never forget us, we men of the crowd, who elected the Domhnall, the best of MacLeod.
If you want to listen to the rest, you can go on the website and there's an audio recording there. But I wanted to spend some time talking about this poem, Pibroch for the Domhnall, because when it first came out, a lot of media publications wrote articles just tearing it to shreds, and I just wanted to actually analyze the poetics of the piece itself, because it seems like nobody has really done that, at least of the ones that I found. Now, personally, compared to his Sonnets for Christ the King, which is, I think, one of the best sonnet collections of the post-World War II era, I feel that Pibroch for the Domhnall, it isn't Mackenzie's best work, per se, although that's true of pretty much all the inaugural poems. Even Robert Frost's is pretty subpar compared to most of the other stuff he wrote. But Pibroch for the Domhnall also isn't as bad as critics say. The fact of the matter is that if it didn't have some merit, nobody would have paid any attention to it at all, or spent so much time tearing it to pieces. And while everyone got offended by its content, and of course accused Mackenzie of being a racist white nationalist, they couldn't actually say why it was a bad poem as a poem. Now, to be fair to Zoe Bee specifically, she said that while she didn't like its content, she's honest enough to acknowledge that as a poem it was pretty good. Now, although Pibroch for the Domhnall wasn't Trump's official inaugural poem, I would argue that it's actually better than the official inaugural poems. And here's why. It's much more in line with what an inaugural poem, I think, should be. It directly talks about the president, it enumerates his qualities, and it addresses his obligations as a leader. Now compare this with all the recent free verse inaugural poems. Maya Angelou vaguely and opaquely talking about change, Elizabeth Alexander rattling off a Whitman-esque catalog of praiseless praise, and Amanda Gorman complaining about why she isn't being sworn in as president instead of Biden. Or take Miller Williams' 1997 inaugural poem, read at Bill Clinton's inauguration, which features such memorable zingers as, "We know the sound of all the sounds we brought," and the children, and how does our garden grow?" Beyond just not being good poems, think these aren't even really good inaugural poems. They're not even really patriotic. They're just written by cynical leftist intellectuals who are openly critical of American values. The purpose of an inaugural poem is to stir public sentiment, and Mackenzie's poem does that. It struck a chord with conservative-minded readers and stirred the ire of liberals. In its sincere patriotism, it is evocative of the verse of Walter Scott, even to the point of adopting anapestic tetrameter, of which Scott was a pioneer. Mackenzie is reaching back to his traditions here. He's a self-conscious artist who knows what he's doing. Now, it's standard fare for praise poems to acclaim the qualities of their patron and even exaggerate them to make them seem greater heroes than their competition, or if they're rulers, eminently qualified to rule, etc., while downplaying or ignoring their personal failings. I would also point to the distinctiveness of the fact that it's the only inaugural poem to actually employ humor. The poem oscillates between stanzas in praise of the president and the values he represents, and stanzas that satirize the corruption in American society. So, for example, a stanza that catalogs different social types in sentimental fashion: the black man forgotten and poverty dying, the poor man, the sick man with young children crying, the soldier, the young, the veterans, etc., is followed by a stanza that begins, whilst hapless old harridans flapping their traps teach women to look and behave like us chaps. This couplet is both funny and true. Feminist liberation in action does largely amount to women just behaving like the men they complain about, lowering them to our level, and promoting a society of promiscuous, aggressive girl bosses. And that unique word, harridans, is so choicely placed there. Mackenzie's poem deftly blends the sentimental with the satirical, which is a difficult feat to pull off. I think the main problem with the poem is that it's too Scottish, and it just doesn't sound like a poem written by an American. Mackenzie himself is of Scottish heritage and proud of it, and I feel like the poem is as much a commentary about himself as it is about Trump. But while it may not be a perfect poem, I will take it any day over The Hill We Climb. Unlike Amanda Gorman, Charles Joseph MacKenzie is actually a good poet. The poem's brazen and even arrogant tone is a good reflection of Trump's personality, honestly. And if he were to commission such a work, this is very likely the kind of thing that he would want to hear about himself. But fat chance of that. While it should be clear that I voted for Trump and will vote for him again if he's the Republican nominee, I have to admit that he is a very crude and boorish person. Like so many other Republican politicians, he simply does not understand the role that artistic patronage can play in legitimating your authority. This is actually one of the main reasons why Julius Caesar was assassinated. He exercised his power in a naked fashion and didn't try to disguise it, and he made a lot of enemies. While the plebs liked him, the elites hated him. Sound familiar? His nephew Octavius made no such mistake. He was a consummate politician who understood the role that poetry can play in legitimating his imperial authority, and he used poets to do this, especially Virgil with the Aeneid. Liberal politicians understand the soft power that artists can exercise and use them to further their ends. Obama was especially good at this in the way that he cultivated friendships with actors and musicians. Now, I don't want to make too much of this because I think liberals go a little too far in this direction. Activist poet professors actually believe that their crappy free verse poems can directly change the structure of society. They put way too much importance on the power of their own work, and it's just absurd. Poetry does have an important social role to play, but it's not going to change the world. Still, conservatives could take a few pointers here, I think, from liberals, because they're just terrible at this. No Republican president has ever had an inaugural poet read at his inauguration. This is the one thing that I think needs to change if the Republican Party is going to get with it. Personally, I'm kind of skeptical that this will happen, but I hope I'm wrong. So, after talking about Mackenzie's poem, next Zoe Bee turns to addressing the SCP's political-themed poems. Here's a clip.
This website has proudly posted poems celebrating the deaths of trans people. They have poems comparing gender-affirming care to child sacrifice. They also have poems covering more classic conservative themes, like poems praising Christopher Columbus for doing genocide and cops for doing murder. They cannot legally be held accountable for any stochastic terrorism that is done by their poets. At best, their pastoral and religious poems are okay. At worst, they're perpetuating racism and the genocide of trans people.
Oh, those terrible cops doing murder! Otherwise known as using lethal force, which is occasionally necessary for you to do your job if you're confronting a dangerous criminal. So there you have it, we are stochastic terrorists. which for the record is a pseudo-scholarly term invented about 5 years ago to describe people who, quote, use language or other forms of communication over social media to incite violence, which basically amounts to just expressing opinions the liberal establishment doesn't like. Zoe Bee also refers to one of the most prolific poets on the site, Susan Jarvis Bryant, as a TERF. Now hey, I'll admit that these poems are offensive. Most of them are satirical. That's their point. Satire is meant to be offensive. That's the source of its humor. Honestly, I really don't see how this stuff is fundamentally different from the offensive content of leftist poets, some of whom, like Ashley M. Jones, are openly racist. Conservatives, as always, are just reacting against the left by adopting their methods. The difference is that conservative political poems are usually reacting to specific events in the news, while liberal political poems are for the most part crafted around theories of white supremacy and toxic masculinity, etc., that the poets learned about in a classroom, while cherry-picking through empirical examples that fit their preconceived framework. The other difference is that conservative poetry is actually funny and even wildly entertaining. Susan Jarvis Bryant's pieces especially are hilarious and full of brilliant verbal pyrotechnics. Liberal free verse poetry, on the other hand, is a humorless snorefest. Ashley Jones's poem Slur It is a vapid catalog of derogatory terms that have been obsolete for at least a half century. It's the dullest, most uncreative thing you'll ever read, but NPR thought it was profound enough to include in their National Poetry Month selection a few years ago, so since NPR said it, it must be a masterpiece. I do have to give credit to Zoe Bee, though, for the amount of research she did about the SCP. Here's kind of another longish clip about that.
I read every single poem on the Society of Classical Poets website. Literally thousands of poems published between 2012 and 2022. And I determined whether they were explicitly political or not. And if they were political, I noted what kind of politics they touched on. And then I put all of that data into a graph to map out the total percentage of political poems over time, as well as the ratios of what type of politics were covered in those political poems. I mean, there was clearly some kind of shift in what people were writing about, especially around 2020, when there was a huge jump in poems about culture war stuff, like COVID, systemic racism, and trans rights. 10 years ago, most of the political poems were about policy stuff like war, or about more squishy, inoffensive topics like patriotism and the good old days.
Now, I have to admit, I am actually really impressed by her diligence in reading all of our poems, and in this graph she made especially. I'm a relative newcomer to the SCP myself, and though I was vaguely aware that this shift had happened, she really does put it in concrete terms. Now, for the reason this shift occurred, that's more speculative. Here's one of Bee's fellow YouTubers hypothesizing about what she thinks is the reason for this shift.
What do you think specifically sparked this increase in, culture war stuff?
Racism. Jericho Brown won the Pulitzer Prize for Poetry in 2019 for The Tradition. This pissed off white supremacists so hard in particular.
Honestly, one might as well ask what prompted free verse poets to start writing all this stuff about white supremacy, because I can guarantee you the same exact shift has occurred on the left. Now, I can guarantee you that almost nobody at the SCP has ever heard of Jericho Brown, or any other recent Pulitzer Prize winner for that matter. The poets who are published there are very practical people with normal jobs, many of them working class people, who don't pay the slightest attention to who's winning the big awards. And this is ultimately where the real divide lies, not in race or gender, but in class. It's a divide between the trendy types of poetry, written by professors and MFA graduates, and popular poetry written by blue-collar types. Susan Jarvis Bryant was a church secretary. Her husband, Mike Bryant, also a poet, was a plumber. Now, take this recent piece by Gregory Ross, who makes his living as a pilot. His poem, My Boy, published on August 13th, is about his son in Little League. It's not the most sophisticated poem of all time, it's just a simple, heartfelt poem about his son playing baseball, and that's perfectly fine. There's a hunger for this kind of poetry, and if the SCP didn't exist, Gregory Ross and most of the other poets on the site would never get published. Because in order to get published today, you have to be someone like Jericho Brown, receiving fellowships from the Guggenheim Foundation, the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study at Harvard, and the National Endowment for the Arts. You have to be a fancy-pants academic or professional type, like a journalist. Another career track once dominated by working-class people, but that has since shut them out. Now, Jericho Brown may have had a hard upbringing in one poem, which is actually an interesting formal innovation that synthesizes the sonnet with the ghazal, an Arabic form. He talks about being beaten by his father. But whatever his origins, Brown is now firmly part of the new elite. All these trendy celebrated poets write about their marginalized status, but they're the furthest thing from marginalized. The left's cultural dominance is total. They've won, but they won't acknowledge that they've won. They'll never stop being incessantly critical of the system, no matter how much they succeed, no matter how good things get. And really, the more they succeed, the more they just push the envelope. Now, in another one of Zoe Bee's videos, where she analyzes the supposed underpinnings of the Western canon, she asks the question, who decides what books get read? Then she starts spouting off Critical Theory 101, and parades out Marxist literary critics like Terry Eagleton to support her views that the construction of the Western canon is all about Foucauldian power dynamics. Well, okay, but one could just as well turn this question around. Now that the Foucauldians are in power, and everything is supposedly getting more equal, who decides what we read now? Well, actually, the Foucauldians do. They give awards to their own crappy poets, their big publishing houses distribute their crappy books, their journals publish their crappy free verse, etc. In every single institution, they're dominant, and the rest of us are just supposed to swallow what they force feed us and be grateful. Educated liberals all have this patronizing view that the working class suffers from false consciousness, and they all need to be re-educated and enlightened by, surprise, surprise, the white-collar intellectual vanguard. Educated urban liberals simply do not understand how blue-collar types think. Now, while I personally enjoy a lot of the political poems on the SCP, I did find myself agreeing with some of what Zoe Bee said. Topical poems have their place, of course, and the SCP site offers an outlet for perspectives that wouldn't otherwise have a voice. But it's also true that none of these topical poems are going to be remembered in 100 years. Now, I'm sure that's a fact that most of their authors would readily admit. Immediacy and relevance, not thinking about posterity, was their motive for writing these poems. And in an online environment where everyone is screaming for attention, you have to be controversial and extreme in order to get noticed. If it weren't for the political poetry, the SCP site wouldn't get as much attention as it does. Zoe Bee wouldn't have made her video. As I discussed in my last episode with Adam Cedia, conservatives tend to not care very much about art. They care about practical things like politics and the economy, and when they do care about art, it's often because there is a political dimension to it. It's probably this simple fact that best explains the shift of the SCP towards more political poems. I think as the website gets more and more popular and attracts more conservatives to it, there's an increase in submissions of the kind of poetry most conservatives are interested in, namely topical political poetry. Conservatives did not start this culture war as much as leftists would like to think that they did. They're just reacting. But if they want to win it, they need to get better at creating art that stands some chance of being remembered. In order for that to happen, you have to go beyond politics, and you can't just talk about nice, inspiring things all the time. That's just lame. You have to engage the ugly side of life if you want to be convincing. And I don't just mean making fun of what liberals are doing. That means creating art that isn't sentimental, or the verbal equivalent of a Thomas Kinkade painting. Sentimentalism is a knee-jerk emotional reaction on the right in a similar kind of way that cynicism and skepticism is for people on the left. Now, I recognize that sentimentalism does have its purpose and its place. I'm not saying people shouldn't do it at all, but it does tend to represent a kind of puritanical attitude that needs to be overcome if you want to create great art. Now, when you eliminate the political and sentimental categories of poetry, there still is a lot of great stuff being produced at the Society of Classical Poets, but nobody ever talks about this. They don't talk about the genuinely excellent poetry, from lyric to epic to translations and innovative metrical experiments. This stuff is neither controversial nor trendy. It's just low-key poetry that, while first-rate, doesn't go viral on the internet, so it just gets ignored. Now, to give credit where credit is due, I think Zoe Bee does acknowledge that some of the nature and religious poetry on the SCP site is okay, and that these make great themes for poetry. She says she would like to see more of it, which I wholeheartedly agree with. Her reflections on this issue are thoughtful and should be taken seriously. In fact, Zoe Bee is probably the SCP's most generous critic. Most of the time, the establishment just shadow cancels us, and when it isn't doing that, Michael Birch is publishing his ranting strawman arguments on the hypertexts. Despite liberals' obsession with wanting to have a conversation, they don't really want to do that for the most part. They just want to discredit us and suppress us. So, thank you, Zoe Bee, for giving us the time of day. and for being kind of fair.